we live largely in French. And what I got from that is ultimately the idea that our identities, collective identities, are not written in stone, that you can change, that you can have different periods of time. I had my entirely Polish period for 9 years, my almost entirely English period, except that I learned French during that period, and then my mixed English-French, often French predominant period after my marriage, and in the law practice, 50-50, and there was absolutely no disadvantage, not only no disadvantage, a tremendous advantage and no inconvenience to being in between. I often spoke of the exhilaration of non-belonging, of feeling at home in every group, feeling at home at a French party, an English party, an Italian party, a Polish party, not being quite in, but not being out either. And in the end, human considerations are much more important than anything else. But when I went to the bar and started practicing human rights, it was obvious that Quebec was going to be a large part of this. So I was involved in some very early parts of fighting against Bill 22, but then the school case in the Supreme Court of Canada in 1984, guaranteeing
higher volume,
guaranteeing the right to English school for people from the rest of the country. I was involved in the signs law, not the case in the Supreme Court of Canada, but we took it to the United Nations, and we got the Bourassa Bill 178 declared illegal, which the Quebec government accepted and implemented. I don't know whether the present government would behave the same way if the United Nations told them that they were in the wrong. I was involved in various cases of francisation, of fils de la langue française, children being admitted to school, municipal, the Rosemere case, where they tried to restrict municipal rights of Anglophones. It has been a constant battle in which we won most of the cases until now, and now we've got a new battle and a much more difficult one because of the notwithstanding clause. But there are two things to be said. First of all, the excuse given by Quebec was not entirely wrong, that Quebec is in danger. Quebec was, in fact, in some danger in the 1970s. It wasn't permanently so, and not since the conquest. I mean, there were different periods when Montreal was a majority French English city, and then it came back to being a French city. It hasn't been a consistent danger as it is claimed today. But in the 1970s, there was a danger. The danger was that birth rates plunged. Quebec's maintenance of the French majority was based on having 10, 15, 20 children. It's obvious that no modern woman could do such a thing, especially in a world in which men and women both earn their living. The idea of having 15 to 20 children is only possible inside certain sects. Yeah?
You could, but you don't want to.
Well, that's right. But it's economically impossible anyway. It's something that could not work. So what happened was all immigrants, or virtually all immigrants, went to English school, and the difference was made up by the 15 or 20 children. I still remember when we used to take vacations in St. Agathe, the people who rented us our place had between them 40 brothers and sisters. I used to, Madame Dufour would tell my mother she doesn't know the names of all her nephews and nieces, and is frequently accosted on the streets of Montreal by somebody who says ma tante, and she's got no idea who that person may be. So that was the world before the Quiet Revolution. It was actually changing after World War II, but you could see the differences. My mother-in-law was an only child in a francophone family, so these things did change. But when the birth rate plunged, it was obvious that if all immigrants went to English school, there would be, at least in Montreal, an English majority, and there were statistics that were quite convincing, an English majority within 10 or 15 years, and that could lead to the decline of French, or at least to a completely two separate worlds, an English Montreal and a French rest of the province, which would not have the economic clout. Therefore, I concluded, and it was difficult, I wrote an article in 1990, I believe, 1992, for the Maxwell Cohen lectures, not memorial, he was still alive. He wanted to have the lectures so he could read them. I said that I had been wrong in opposing the school part of Bill 101. The school part was necessary. There had to be some restriction. Of course, I also suggested that people be allowed to take 1 year in the other language, or 2 years if they wanted to. I suggested that the teaching of the other language should be on a high level, which it has not always been in French schools and still is not. But nevertheless, there was a real reason. And I broke with the hardline Alliance Quebec of Mr. William Johnson, because they didn't see any reason. They were really representing English as advocates, whereas I was trying to see the whole picture and advocate for both. And I want to repeat, there's a difference between liking a place and liking its nationalism. I grew up in Poland and I loved Poland, I still do. I loved its poetry, its music, I still read in Polish, but I hated the Catholic nationalism, narrow Catholic nationalism that occasionally came out of people that bothered me. I love Quebec. I don't like narrow nationalism. I liked English. English Quebec was extremely welcoming. I remember taking my 2 grade 3 and 4 teachers to the faculty club in the 1990s. I was so grateful for the welcome that I got in the English community, but I didn't like the hardline Alliance Quebec thing, saying the somewhat anti-French signaling, the restrictive attitude. So I think, looking at it objectively, Quebec was right in restricting access in some ways to English schools. Of course, they should have been more generous with exemptions. They should have been much more active in making certain that the schools met, that people exchanged, that everybody was bilingual. But they were right to that one extent. On the other hand, they were also right in saying that signs should be bilingual, because Montreal, if you remember the 1960s, 70s, was all English signs, which was, except in the Far East, and that's bizarre in a city where the majority is French. But on the other hand, no one can tell me what rationale there is for saying that the signs should be only in French, how that affects the survival of French, how all the other restrictive things, trying to make sure that people, for instance, today, when they said you can't have a marriage certificate in English, even though some people will be leaving Quebec and we're obviously going to have to get translations and so on, there is absolutely no reason for the petty nationalism that has spread. But that is the problem, the distinction between the one point where the nationalists were right, that French could be lost, that to maintain both French and English, you had to limit access to the schools, and the nationalism, which all over the world is the same. And people only see their own point of view, and they close institutions and act against their own interests. And in Quebec, you can see that The nationalists just never give up. You win a case, etc., they come back. Let me give you an example. The legal system. We have a system in British North America. British North America Act said either English or French can be used in the courts as the person wants. It worked perfectly. You know, there's all sorts of things wrong with our justice system. Access to justice is difficult. It's expensive. Sometimes the results are confusing, almost arbitrary. All sorts of things are wrong. But that one part was right. Well, they're back to fighting it. That's the one thing that they don't want, which worked perfectly. There is absolutely no reason to deny people medical services, government services, to divide the English into two groups, the real English minority, which is most of it is left anyway, and the people who came in from outside afterwards. It's absurd, and the nationalists never come back. But it's not, never go back on it. They forget it for a few years, and then they're back demanding the same things, which have nothing to do with any interests of the French. On the contrary, are contrary to the interests of Francophones. But I want to stress one thing. This is not an anti-Quebec position. The nationalism is the same everywhere, all over the world. Flemish nationalists got rid of the University of Louvain, which was one of the great universities. Because it was in French, they didn't want it on their territory. Now, what could possibly have gone into their head to get rid of one of the great institutions and libraries and so on in Europe, simply because they spoke the language that was spoken 50 kilometers away? It was ridiculous. Look at the Middle East dispute, always a dangerous thing, and I will not get into it because there'll be a fight. But no one has yet suggested what the future will be, how you will reconcile those people. Nobody talks about it because each side only sees its point of view. And all over the world, the Serbians and the Croats, it was a horrible thing. So it's not anti-Quebec, it's anti-nationalism that I would say. And the present battle against Bill 96 and the present wave of language legislation is based on an absolute myth. The myth is that French is in danger. Now, anybody who's lived here as long as I have will know that French is much better off. The city looks more French. French is being spoken. There's been a tremendous effervescence of French culture. Literature, I've participated in it. I've published in French. I've lived in it. But the theory is French is always in danger. We're always the victims. And there is a terrible book by a man called Frédéric Lacroix, Pourquoi la loi 101 est un échec, in which he claims that French is declining constantly as figures that can be made demonstrable. You can demonstrate that they're incorrect. For instance, he counts the bilingual hospitals as being only English. And of course, then you skewer you go into the Vic or the Jewish and you see how much of the treatment is given in French. And by claiming that they're only English, you get the wrong figures as to how much English or French there is. By claiming that somebody who came in from the outside never needs English services, even though that's his language, and denying him English services. So the real answer to it is we have to go. It's not enough just to fight in court, and we may or may not win with the notwithstanding clause. You have to convince the majority that it's not in their interest, first of all, that it is in their interest for their children to be bilingual in North America, to be French, to be sure, but also to be perfectly bilingual, and not just to be able to speak enough to write a business letter, but to be able to participate in the culture of North America and the world, because English is dominant, maybe not forever. Some people who think Spanish might be in 100 years, so be it. But it's English is important for them, as it is French is important for all Anglophones. And it's a battle for the hearts of Quebecers. What the claim is, they look at native language and they say French has declined. But you know, English has declined more sharply. And the reason why French and English have both declined is because we're a nation of immigrants. There is now a dispute as to whether we can afford to take as many immigrants, and indeed there is some limit, if you like, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, but at the same time, in a country which takes in large numbers of immigrants, it is obvious that both leading languages will take a hit in language used at home. But that doesn't really constitute a danger to French. I always used exclusively Polish with my parents. Didn't mean that it was a danger to either English or French. And the same thing, if people speak Hindi at home, they will have to speak English or French, depending on where they are, both presumably, to work and to live and to be culturally successful. Now, the simple answer to the claim of French danger is something I've published recently in a book called Le Français en danger, ? It's a book, a collection of essays published at Laval University. My essay argues that there is no danger for a simple reason. There is not a single case anywhere in the world where a language has disappeared, where there was a free and obligatory education system in that language. Not one. Languages disappeared, like in French, withered in the rest of the country when they passed laws making English the only language of education. Louisiana is the same thing. Premier Legault keeps referring to Louisiana, but he forgets that Louisiana passed a law saying all schools in English. If you passed a law saying all schools will be in English, French would be gone in a generation. The best example of that is when the British government passed the Education Act of 1857. They had a free and obligatory system of education, only 4 grades to begin with, in English across the UK. And it was a very progressive law, very admirable law. It was an important thing to do. But they forgot Wales. In Wales, in 1857, 80% of the people spoke Welsh and 20% spoke English. 2 generations later, it was the other way around because of the Education Act. Not that the Education Act was wrong. Don't get me wrong. I think the Education Act was one of the great achievements of the 19th century, and I think all the progressive people in England, like Dickens and so on, were very proud that the country had passed an obligatory education system. But in Quebec, we have a free and obligatory because of Bill 101. Only a few people are exempted from it. Free and obligatory system in French. There is no way French can disappear. What the Quebec nationalists really want, they deny it. What the ultranationalists want is for the immigrants to study only French. They're not happy with somebody who goes to French school and so on and comes back out perfectly bilingual. And they say so openly when they want to discourage English cégep or English universities. And right now, the Quebec unions have been advertising saying, get your university studies in French. If you be a real Quebecer, should go to a French university. But McGill, Concordia, and the others are in the interests of all Quebecers. And you know, many nationalist Quebecers teach their own children to speak French. In my wife's family, there's some nationalists, and one particular person was very actively nationalist, and her daughter speaks perfect English. You couldn't tell that she's not an Anglophone. They don't really care about that. What they care about is the immigrant. They want the immigrant limited, and that's just plain wrong. So I think the battle is for the hearts of Quebecers, has to be explained to them that limiting English and taking away from them the opportunity to participate fully in North America, in the North American world, in its music, in its literature, etc., is against them. Bill 96 discriminates against Francophones as much as it discriminates against Anglophones. And you have a perfect example when they say that it is illegal to ask during an interview whether you speak English or not. You're interviewing somebody for a job, and you can't ask it unless you get prior permission from the Office québécois de la langue française, which they don't really want to give. They'll bend over backwards. They'll give you the permission if you say, I need an English teacher. But if you're hiring, for instance, I know that when I'm hiring lawyers, I can't ask that question. That discriminates against Francophones who have learned English. Why? I mean, I don't care, but I know that in my office, every lawyer has to speak both languages. You just don't know what the next call will be. If they tell me that I cannot verify whether a candidate speaks English, I have to conduct the interview in French and not ask that question, the answer will be, I might be tempted to choose the Anglophone candidate because I know that the Anglophone candidate speaks English. And if I interview him or her in French and they're excellent in French, there is no danger of a problem that way. Now, of course, it doesn't work that way in practice. What happens in practice is when I'm interviewing somebody, before I ask the question, they demonstrate their bilingualism in some way or other. They all know that this is how it is and it's stupid, and they either switch from one language to the other, or they hand in an essay they've written in the other language, and so on. So it doesn't work, but it is fundamentally discriminatory against bilingual Francophones. It hurts their opportunities. And I wonder why a person should be able to profit from being particularly good at computer and programming, from being a good mathematician, from being from sign language or whatever, but you cannot profit from the fact that you've learned another language. You cannot get any benefit. It's silly and it's wrong. And all of the provisions of Bill 96 are aimed, they keep saying Montreal, we must keep Montreal French. Do we not know the reality? Montreal has been a bilingual city since 1763, in one proportion or another. There was a period it was majority English. There was a period in the late 19th century. There was a period when it was less English. But there's never been a time when Montreal was a 100% French city. So what they're really telling you, the words are, let's keep a French Montreal. The real words are, let's make Montreal unilingual. And they keep saying things like Quebec must be as French as Alberta is English. But it cannot be. It cannot be for a number of reasons. Because in the present world, I said before, it may be that it'll be Spanish in the next century, but in the present world, you go to Holland or you go to Scandinavia, and English is present, and people do learn this. So what we have to do is have a campaign not only on the details of the law, but on the, what word shall we say, on the fact that we're not only defending English rights or a community with vested rights, we're defending the freedom, individual freedom, and the larger horizons of all of the people in Quebec, very much including the Francophone majority. It is in the interest of the Francophone majority to have McGill and Concordia and bishops. It is in the interest of the French community to have excellent teaching of English, which they've never had in their schools for all sorts of reasons, but it is in the interests of Francophones to have not only the teaching of English language, but of English culture. And it is absolutely false to think that knowledge of one language prevents you from knowing another perfectly. Even if you look at literature, you'll find that people like Conrad, Joseph Conrad, Nabokov, Nancy Houston, all sorts of writers wrote in another language, Beckett, in another language as well as in their native language. There is no contradiction and no harm. And we've got to convince Quebec that this is so. But the difficulty is very strong, very great. And the difficulty is great because of the nature of nationalism. People tend to side with their own group. And even if they have doubts, they often have a great difficulty getting up and saying, my group is wrong. My leaders are wrong. You have a hard time. It's not difficult to demonstrate what I'm saying to a large number of Francophones, but it's difficult to have them come forward and say Bill 96 is wrong. And you see that even federalist media, supposedly federalist media, like La Presse, are publishing nationalist articles. Nationalism has become a mantra. Everybody is nationalist. One of the things about Quebec is that the word nationalism has a positive sound. I'm a nationalist. Everybody says I'm a nationalist, even those who are not. Even those who are really very much non-nationalists pretend to be nationalists. Nationalism is a good thing. Well, let's look all over the world and see what nationalism has done. All the countries that were partitioned for nationalism, India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine, Yugoslavia, Ukraine and Russia. What has nationalism brought about? Every time it harms both the majority and the minority. And we have to persuade people, that in a context such as Quebec, which is a very open society, a prosperous society, a society with open borders to the rest of the country and pretty open borders to the rest of the West, it is in everybody's interest not to be sectarian and not to pass laws saying we're going to look into the medical records, for instance, and see if the doctor has written his notes in English or not. First of all, there may be a very good reason for writing the notes in English for the patient. The patient must be able to understand what's in his file and so on. And if the patient asks for it in English, it should be in English. Or the patient may say, doctor, in 5 years, I'm planning to live in somewhere else in Canada for a couple of years, and I have to transfer my medical file. So could you do it that way? No. Yesterday, a problem arose in my office, and I'd like Mr. Lacroix to tell me how that endangers the future of French. We settled a case with the city of Montreal, and it meant each side giving each other a quittance, signing away certain rights. My client doesn't speak any French. She only speaks English. The city refused to sign a document in both languages. Why? Because we were given instructions from Quebec that it has to be French only if we sign. But this lady doesn't understand if you do it in French only. You've settled in French with us, but you have to have her understand. Don't you understand that there is a risk that somebody will come in 5 years and say, I didn't understand? And it's in your interest as much as in her interest to have a bilingual thing. No way. You can go and get an interpreter, or you can translate it yourself, but our city cannot sign a document, except with the permission of the minister, sign a document which was written in both languages. Now, I would like somebody to tell me how that promotes the survival of French. What the advantages, and why you can't write a will in English, a notarial will in English, and why you can't have a deed in English between two English people. And oh, the most ridiculous thing in the world. They say that in the public service or in the municipal services, two Anglophones working side by side should have to speak French to each other. Now, how does that promote the survival of French? And the other thing is, how has the fact, and they look at the language spoken at home and they get into despair about French in decline, how has the fact that I, in fact, spoke Polish with my parents affected the future of English and French in Quebec? And I do remember when I was in grade 4, a year after I came, there was another Polish boy that came to my school, and we were both lonely, and our English was not perfect yet, and we spoke Polish at recess. Now, do you think that has affected either one of us negatively? You think I can't speak English? Or he became a doctor and studied medicine at the U of T. He certainly became very anglicized. But was anybody harmed by us speaking Polish in the schoolyard? And that's the type of pettiness that we've got to fight. So I suggest that what we do is a double battle. We have to go through the court battle, which we will win a part of, I suppose, and not win another part of, and fight against the against the notion that they're all that they have to win because French will disappear in the courts. But we also have to go on a campaign, and not as a minority. I don't really see myself as part of any minority. I speak English and French, and when I speak each one of them, I think in that language, and that's all there is to it. And the same goes for Polish. But what we have to say is that this is a fight for all Quebecers, for freedom of thought, for freedom of opportunity, for mobility. You don't want to have a situation where the Anglophones alone can take a job anywhere, but you can't even take a 3-year job at the head office in New York because learning English, I know that the Quebec government has said that immigrants have to learn French in 6 months. I think that's I'd like to, I note that Mr. Legault has not learned it properly in 65 years. So I would challenge anybody to, English in his case, I would challenge anybody to learn a language in 6 months. Oh yes, and there is another argument that I think we have to put to rest. The argument is that French is so much harder. You've got to learn French earlier, spend more time in French, etc. French is a hard language, and the details of the grammar are arcane and difficult, and it's a beautiful language, and it pays to learn it well and to write it well. And I hate all the people who are trying to modernize it and get rid of the aka, because it will not be the same thing. I hope I don't have to read Flaubert in Newspeak in the future. But do you think English is so easy? I'll give a task to anybody. Write an essay that sounds like D.H. Lawrence or Virginia Woolf. And I think most people will not be able to write an essay in that way. To read English correctly, to write English correctly is just as difficult. What is less complicated is the actual grammar, but on the other hand, pronunciation is very difficult in English. And I can assure you, somebody who ended up in an English school without understanding a word, English can pose a challenge. I lived through that challenge, I think, successfully, but I don't think one language, you should argue that one language is more difficult than another. And what we have in Quebec is two of the great cultures of the West, English and French. I think I don't want to disparage either German or Russian literature and so on and say that they're not as good, but English and French are magnificent, and it's an opportunity for all of us. So to defend English in services, in everything else, we have to persuade the majority that it's in their interest. There's one case that I will end with that I pleaded, which was the Rosemere case, the municipal case, in which Mr. Justice Reeves accepted my argument that there may be special rules for schools, but insofar as services are concerned, everybody might want services in the other language. The example being, and he nodded enthusiastically, if they're doing Shakespeare in the park, you may be a Francophone, Justice Reeves, but you may want to attend. You may want them to, you may want to hear the Shakespeare plays. And if they did Molière in the park, any Anglophone might want to go. So the demand for an English or French service doesn't depend on some belonging to a definite group. It depends on circumstances. And as you see in my life, it can be different at different times of our lives, different for different purposes. Some people might prefer to have their health services in one language and other services in another. It's an individual thing which people can go for. It's the absolute cruelty of our government, which wants to tell somebody when he's at a moment of stress in his life, when he's being questioned by income tax or by the police or by somebody like that, you were not an old Anglo, you came here after the law, so you have to do it in French, even though we know how to do it in English. It's cruel. It's just like it's cruelty when this government tells a young man with a turban, you can't be a policeman or a teacher, or a young woman with a hijab that you can't teach anymore. She's got a scarf, not without any advantage to anybody else. Bill 96 is a law where everybody loses, with the arguable exception of a couple of bureaucrats who are put to administer it. What we have to persuade people of, not as members of a minority, but as Quebecers, as members of the society, it's in your interest to get rid of restrictive legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. I will moderate a question and answer, trying to alternate between the people in the auditorium and the Zoom audience. In the case of the Zoom audience, I will need help. I will need the staff to prompt me to questions on the screen. So I'm looking at, for the in-person audience, I have to bring you the mic. You have to speak into the mic for the virtual audience to hear. So I'm looking for a question. While I'm waiting, I'll be right with you. Julius, what are your thoughts on what works to persuade, to win the hearts and minds of the majority population?
Well, for one thing, writing in French, publishing in the French milieu. I published in that Laval book, but there's a problem with nationalism. All my life, I've had no difficulty getting into Le Devoir and La Presse, and I still do not on all other subjects. But when it comes to Bill 96, I could not publish in either one of them. They just wouldn't. Now, Lise Bissonnette used to boast, when she was the one who brought to my attention that I was too harsh on Bill 101. She said, have I ever not published something you've written or modified it, etc.? What are you complaining about? Right. And she was right. But with this Bill 96, it was very difficult. You could publish very bland things, individual things. Maybe you could change something. But a frontal attack was simply not. There was a particular article that I actually wrote in French. It was translated and published as a headline in the Gazette. I couldn't get into any of the French.
Okay, I'm coming with the mic.
Thank you. Something that I think people really need to consider is that language starts in the brain. We don't all have the same capacity to learn languages. So I'm also trilingual. but not as trilingual as you, because my brain has those limitations. There are people who aren't so great even with their language, their mother tongue. There are other people who can learn several, 5 more, I don't know, more. This is something that I think also has to be addressed, because it isn't just a matter of will, of goodwill, that, oh, well, if we keep trying, we'll be able to be multilingual. I wish that French psychologists who would understand these things about the brain would bring this up too. And also, well, this is a little different, that I believe that language is kind of organic, meaning that it does change and should change with the generations. I know you don't like that, you already said. and that's why, the French, I guess, make laws about not allowing language to change, whereas I don't think the English have made laws, and that's why we need help to understand Shakespeare, because our language has changed. The young change it, the young are creative, and they change language, and I think that's okay. And then I think we should be speaking franglais here, Franglish, whatever. It would be a richness. Anyway.
Well, first of all, about the law does provide for it. Even the Quebec law has ability to, you can exempt children for disability. They are very restrictive about it. They are very mean, but theoretically, if you interpret it generously, and one person who was generous about it, and the English never gave her credit because she was so nationalistic, Louise Baudouin. When she was the minister, if it was an individual case, Louise Baudouin was, you could get through to the minister, and she would say, the future of Quebec doesn't depend on this child going to English school. So there is a disability problem, and especially the disability problem is after 15 or 16. That's why we should start languages early, because the plasticity of the brain is such that you can learn languages more easily at an earlier age. But there is a problem that some people will not be able to, and the answer is not to make their life miserable, but to make their life as comfortable as possible, both ways. There will be some people who can't learn English, and you have to make it possible for them to function. Some people who can't learn French or can't learn French properly, and they're not just matters of the brain. There could be problems of hearing, problems, all sorts of things that make that possible. When you talk about languages changing, I agree with you. Languages always change, and the French language changes too. I mean, my French students have difficulty with 18th or 19th century French, despite all the rules about it not changing. And I don't think Shakespeare is the best example. Shakespeare is still understandable, but if you go 100 years before Shakespeare, it's very difficult to understand. Chaucer, you have a few hundred years. Rabelais is just as difficult to understand, more difficult to understand actually than Shakespeare, more distant from us. But what used to happen before when languages changed? Before, remember, I made the theory that as long as there's a free and obligatory system of education, the language can't disappear. But in the past, there were no free and obligatory systems of education before the 19th century, before the French Revolution. There were occasionally periods of times when somebody like Charlemagne would establish, or King Alfred the Great would establish some schools, but generally speaking, that didn't happen. So what happened when groups of people lived together, like the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons, like the Germanic Franks and the Celts and the Latins? What happened is they gradually mixed, intermarried, and they created a new language. English as a new language didn't exist. Certainly, if you try to read Beowulf, it's a totally different German language. And in this world of schools, that doesn't happen. That's not a plea for abolishing schools. But what it means is that right now, groups keep their identity through school, whereas in the past they used to merge. And in the past, there was just as much hate and just as much difficulty because some people wouldn't mix and marry, etc., out, often on religious grounds. So you have Spain under the Muslims, where there was a period when the Muslims, the Christians, and the Jews got along beautifully, but they never mixed. And gradually, as the sort of Christian reaction set in, they expelled both the Jews and the Muslims. So in the old days, however, there was this tendency for languages to change. If you talk about Franglais, if we lived here in a period of time when there were no obligatory schools, we'd all end up speaking Franglais. But right now, what it is there are schools and there are certain rules. My objection is not to languages changing. Of course, languages change. If you read, I just reread Pickwick Papers for fun, and there are all sorts of words dealing with managing horses and stoves and so on that we don't use anymore. So, of course, languages change. But I don't like the idea of people coming in because of the political correctness of today and saying we're going to feminize all words, or we're going to get rid of the masculine and feminine. French in particular suffers from it because English doesn't have that. But I think sudden changes are difficult. And the best example of that is Ataturk. When he took over in Turkey, they changed the alphabet, but they also changed a lot of the rules from the Ottoman language, etc. And the result is that today's students in Turkey will have a very hard time reading a novel written in 1900, not only in 1600, but in 1900, because they put a distance. One of the things that's happened with French now is that people don't use the passé simple. So when you read a 19th century novel, you have a hard time with the passé simple. I don't want sudden political changes for reasons of political correctness, but languages do evolve. Yeah.
Okay, I'll turn to the Zoom chat. Ingrid is asking for you to comment on the distinction between signage on private property and public property.
Well, there are no rules on private property. You can put up your sign in any language you want, subject to municipal bylaws, which might limit the color or the size or whatever that you have. On public or commercial, not just on private property, residential, you can do whatever you want. But on commercial, they say that French has to be twice the size of English. That is a terribly petty rule, inviting the Office québécois de la langue française to bring tape measures and start looking at those things. I always suggested that they should, simply being bilingual is good enough, or trilingual, but you never get anywhere. But you can put up anything you want on your house. You can put up a political sign or anything at all. There's also some rules that you are entitled to have political, you can put things up on city property. They are able to have boards, special boards for that purpose, but they can't prevent people from advertising. There's the case of the city of Peterborough, where they said that if you don't have any place, then you're allowed to use the city poles, the telegraphic, or whatever poles they still have in digital age. You can use them for signage. But they could probably legislate those, and Quebec, if it thought about it, would legislate that it be only French. However, as I said, so far, no rules on your residential property.
Maura McEwen.
Yes, I would like to make two salient points. Number one, I wonder if the average nationalist realizes the terrible hit that the economy of this province will take when you just have unilingual French. You are not going to be able to attract skilled workers who are engineers and so on necessarily, who can't speak French. They will go to other provinces. And number two, also the impact that research is going to take, because a lot of researchers who are very good in what they do necessarily don't speak French and will be attracted elsewhere. That's all I have to say.
No, I think there's absolutely no doubt that Quebec will take a hit. And the statistics they use are false. They keep saying our population is growing. It's not true that there is an exodus. But if you looked at, they had an analysis of the growth in Quebec, I think in one of the French papers, maybe in Le Devoir, which is usually, despite being more nationalist, is more open-minded. And they showed that births and deaths were about equal in Quebec last year, and that there was a net loss of population to the other provinces. The gain was all immigration. And then the question is, will they stay and will they become bilingual? If you prevent them from becoming bilingual, they may not stay. And you're perfectly right that people don't realize what a disadvantage it is in terms of scientists, etc. I always used to argue that McGill, for instance, is a tremendous magnet for academics from the rest of North America. Your average professor at Harvard can't come and teach a class in French at the U of M, but he can come to McGill. And the U of M students can benefit from his presence. They can go and listen to his lectures and so on. So of course it's a terrible loss. But remember, we can't blame Quebec for everything in the world. Today's woke movement does the same thing by saying that we're not going to authorize a scientific team if it doesn't have the right number of people from different ethnic groups and genders and so on. Even though, obviously, if you have 5 brilliant young men who have an idea, you should subsidize them, as you should 5 brilliant young women. It's contrary to the interest of the research to go into the genealogy of the people who are doing the research.
Time for just one short final question. Sarah Cohen in the Zoom audience, I see your hand up. Would you unmute yourself and speak up, please? Sarah Cohen in the Zoom audience. Okay, in that case, there's a woman here in the auditorium. I'll bring you the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, just one comment that about the dangers of having the government have these discriminatory laws, in that it legitimizes a lot of individual very dangerous behaviors. The other day, my partner, who speaks no French but has to live here, was trying to park on our street right in front of his house, and he wasn't allowed access by a policeman who, because there was a parade going down, but the guy said, my friend told the policeman, I just live right there, I won't go past that, you know, there's no problem, you're here to protect me. And the guy said, no, I don't want to, because I don't want to. You know, and it was legit, it was because he's an Anglophone, it was clear, you know, it just, I don't want to. And he is legitimized because the government supports. And I mean, I'm sure everybody in this audience has a number of similar stories.
Well, that is what I said when I pointed out that people tend to support their own group, and they tend to fall into line with it. And, you know, it's always a terrible thing because people get very upset and very angry because it's different. And of course it is different. But if you set up the example of Nazi Germany, where most people didn't kill anybody. Your average German didn't kill his neighbor. He didn't even insult his neighbor. He didn't do anything, but he went along with it. He didn't say anything wrong. And my father had clients, he was an accountant, and there was a gentleman whose income tax he used to do, come once a year. And his wife was a German Jewish lady who finished her law studies in 1933. They're both long gone now. In 1933. And she said one of the most amazing things was how many people stopped saying hello to her on the street. People who had been in her class, etc. On the other hand, some were gushing. Some were making a point of saying a particularly warm hello, people that she wasn't particularly close to, but would come up to say, this is terrible, this is going to pass, don't worry about it, and so on. But it's true that policies of that sort legitimize people who have prejudices or simply who feel that they have to be loyal to their own group and it's in their interest. That is why when you have policies, you always should be able to justify it in serious terms. You can justify the English-French school. You can show it statistically and with everything else that happened. But why you should say that a policeman should not serve people in Montreal when a large proportion of the people will need his services in English, you cannot